In this video, we'll study the specificities of base tables and navigations in objects for smart devices. For a better comprehension of the topic, we'll consider a simple example where we'll develop a query using a panel for smart devices. This panel will enable us to view a country's data. Additionally, we'll be able to view that country's speakers grouped by conference in a grid. Then we'll make a comparison against a similar web panel in order to understand the differences in the determination of base tables and navigation lists. If we analyze this panel, we'll see that it will comprise a fixed part with the name of the country, the button to view it, and, in the application bar, the Add button to add a new speaker. And it'll also have the part corresponding to the grid. This grid is similar to the grid of the list of the speakers work with. Here, instead of the company name, we show the resume. When we tap on the item, we access the view, as in the list of speakers that we already know. Except that, here, we program it manually. We'll see that later. And we also added an icon to view the detail of conferences. In the video, where we mentioned events, we saw that navigations are separated and are solved with data providers, one for each part of the panel. So, which tables will be navigated in each case? And how will each of these base tables be determined? That's what we'll see next. Let's see the example in GeneXus. Let's quickly review the application at runtime. We go to Country, and, for example, in Uruguay, we access the panel with the new icon to view only Uruguay's speakers. And here we can view the conferences and also the speakers of each conference. We can access the speaker and view the detail, or we may access a conference and its detail screen. We have the Add button to add a speaker to that country, and the View button to view the country's details. Let's first see how we called the Session Speakers by Country panel. On the list of the Work With Devices country, we added an image on the grid, and in the Tap event, we made the call to the panel, as we will see, passing the Country ID attribute by parameter. Now let's take a look at the panel. First, note that in the rules, we indicated that this panel will receive the Country ID attribute by parameter. In the layout, we see that in the fixed part, we have the country name attribute and also the View button. If we look at the associated event, we can see that it's calling the country detail, and it also passes the country ID as parameter. On the other hand, also in the fixed part of the panel, we have the application bar with the Add Associated button. Let's see this event. What we do in this event is to use a speaker variable that's based on the speaker business component. We'll assign the country ID, the one received by parameter, so we initialize the speaker country. Then we call the detail of speaker in insert mode. And then we'll pass the speaker variable as parameter. Now we also have the grid that will have its own base table independently from the base table of the fixed part. We should remember that this is a specificity of the smart device object. Fixed part and grid determine independent navigations. Each will have its own base table. This defines an important difference as compared to web panels. So, in smart devices, we must remember that the refresh event will navigate the base table of the fixed part, and the load event will be in charge of navigating the base table corresponding to the grid. If we look at the entity relation diagram in our model, here we only see some tables, the ones we'll be using for this video, we can see that when the base table is country, the extended table will include country only, and we don't have n-to-1 relations. If we analyze the one for session, we see that we only have session. If we analyze the one for session speaker, we have session speaker, speaker, and indirectly country, and also session. And lastly, the one for speaker will be speaker and country. If we want to refresh these concepts or read more about them, you can view related videos on the wiki or those included in the GeneXus course. Let's get back to the panel where we'll now think how to determine the base table of the fixed part of this panel. We'll consider the attributes belonging to the fixed part, in this case only country name, and then all the attributes belonging to the events associated with the fixed part, in this case the view and add events. These are outside of a for each command. Therefore, in our case, the country ID attribute is used in both events, and together with the attribute of the fixed part of the layout, they're the ones that will determine the base table of this fixed part. If we had programmed the refresh event, which is not the case, then the attributes appearing there, which were not inside of for each, would also be part of the determination of the base table for this fixed part. The attributes of the conditions tab would also participate, though in this case there aren't any. That's why the base table will then be country. To confirm this, let's take a look at the navigation list. If we search for the data provider that corresponds to the fixed part, we will see that it's actually navigating the country table, taking the corresponding country that was received by parameter. We also have to identify the base table of the grid part. Of course, the attributes belonging to the grid will be part of it. In this case, speaker image, speaker full name, and speaker ID. We also have the attributes of the load event, which are outside the for each. Here we have the speaker CV mini attribute that's used several times in the event. And additionally, we have the event associated with the image and the event associated with the grid when we tap on the element. It's the view speaker event. Let's now see the attributes used in these events. In the image1.tap event, we have the session ID attribute. And then in the view speaker event, we have the speaker ID attribute. There are more things we must take into account. For example, we have the order of the grid. Here, we have the session name attribute that's used to group the speakers by session as well. And we have the filters in the search property. Here we have the speaker full name, session name, and session description attributes. And also, we have the base TRN property, where we indicate session.speaker. The conditions at the grid level, or at the level of the conditions tab, general for the whole object, are also part of this. So we don't have conditions, and we don't use any attribute in either of them. In sum, we have attributes of the speaker, ID, image, full name, and resume table, and we have attributes of the session, ID, name, description. The base table will then be session speaker, because, from its extended table, we obtain all the attributes we need. If we now take a look at the navigation of the data provider corresponding to the grid, we will see that it's actually doing a for each to the session speakers table, and it's filtering by country. What country? The one received by parameter. We should keep in mind that navigations of the fixed part and of the grid are independent from one another. Filters are not established automatically between them. What causes, in the first navigation, in the fixed part, and also in the grid, the filtering to be done by country ID and also by country is the fact that the country ID attribute was received as parameter, but not the fact that the base tables are related. By way of example, And to clarify the differences between web panels and objects for smart devices, we've prepared this similar panel in a web environment. We have the country name attribute in the form, and the grid with the same attributes. Speaker name, speaker ID, the variable, speaker image. This image and the events are similar. They use the same attributes and call objects that solve the same functionality in a similar way. It's interesting to see the navigation. First, note that the panels have a single navigation. If we take a look at the base table of the load event, it's session speaker. From that table, the rest of the attributes necessary will be solved through the extended table. Now let's go back to the presentation. If we summarize what we saw in the demo, the fixed part and the grid each have their own base table, and the navigations of each are determined independently from one another. The attributes that will determine the base table of the fixed part are attributes included in the fixed part of the layout, in our case, country name, attributes referenced in the general conditions, tab conditions, in our case, none, attributes appearing in the events of the form, outside for each commands, that is, those of the refresh, and events associated with controls of the fixed part of the form, in our case, the view button, and in the application bar, the add button. So, the base table in our case will be country. The attributes that will determine the grid's base table are attributes included in the grid, attributes referenced in the grid's conditions, order, search, and advanced search, and those of the general conditions tab. Attributes appearing in the grid's events, outside for each commands, that is, those of the load and events associated with controls within the grid, in our case, that of the view session event and the tap on the image. When the grid's base TRN property has been set up, the base table originates here, but the previous attributes that we mentioned have to belong to the extended table for everything to be well defined. So, in our example, the grid's base table will be session speaker. As we already know, GeneXus identified the base tables of each part, country and session speaker. Despite their indirect one-to-n relation, these tables will have independent navigations by default. This means that it's like having a pair of parallel, non-nested for eaches. If we want to link the navigations, we'll have to do it explicitly. In this example, it was because we received in an attribute parameter. Also note that since the fixed part must retrieve a single record, for a well-designed panel, it must be possible to filter the corresponding base table, country, in order to retrieve the record desired. Because we're receiving by parameter in the country ID attribute, this will occur automatically. Additionally, since the grid navigates the session speakers table, which has country ID in its extended table, the filter will also operate on this table, and only the sessions of speakers from that country will be shown. And with that, we've finished with this topic.